The Sierra Nevada has a way of hiding its secrets. Its peaks, jagged, wind-carved, and cloaked in eternal snow, have seen centuries of storms and silence. On the morning of July 18th, 1992, that silence was broken not by thunder, but by a faint metallic glint beneath the ice. Two hikers, Alan and Michelle Aguilar, were making their way across the old Mendel Glacier when Michelle stopped mid-step. Something in the ice caught the sunlight, something too straight, too deliberate to be nature's work. Alan knelt, brushing away the frost with his glove. Beneath a sheet of blue-white ice lay a curved section of metal pocked with rivets, its surface bearing the ghost of paint. A pale star and faded stripes. The couple stared in disbelief. "It's an airplane," Alan whispered. "A World War II airplane." By dusk, a rescue team from the U.S. Forest Service had arrived with cutting torches and generators. As the ice melted, the glacier gave up its secret inch by inch. First a wing, then a cockpit, then something that made the toughest of men fall silent. There, entombed in ice clear as glass, lay the body of a young pilot. His flight jacket was still zipped, goggles frozen to his brow, fingers locked around the buckle of his harness as if he'd tried, in his final moment, to pull himself free. His nameplate read, Second Lieutenant William R. Greeley, U.S. Army Air Forces. The coroner would later say the preservation was unnatural. His skin was pale but intact, his dog tag still hanging against his chest. It was as if time itself had stopped the instant his aircraft struck the mountain. For nearly 50 years, Lieutenant Greeley had lain there, untouched, unaged, waiting for the world he left behind to find him again. In nearby Fresno, news spread quickly. Reporters called it the pilot who came back from ice. Families of missing airmen began phoning the county sheriff, asking the same question. Could it be ours? The Army Air Forces had lost 5 P-38 Lightnings in the Sierra during 1942 to 1943 training runs from Muroc Army Airfield. Records were incomplete. Weather had been brutal. For decades, official reports listed them simply as missing, presumed crashed in mountains. Now one had been found. Within days, a team from the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency and the Defense POWMIA Accounting Center arrived on site. They documented every fragment, photographing serial numbers, engine plates, and the fragments of aluminum scattered across the ice field. The aircraft's identification plate confirmed it. Lockheed P-38 F1LO Lightning, serial number 42-13259. A single-seat twin-boom interceptor designed by Kelly Johnson, the P-38 was one of the fastest fighters of its age, capable of 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, but treacherous in high mountain turbulence. Greeley's unit, the 339th Fighter Squadron, had been flying altitude training missions to prepare for deployment to the Pacific. His last radio transmission, logged at 0903 hours, November 18th, 1942, read simply, "Visibility poor. Trying to climb over the cloud deck. Tell the boys I'll see them at Muroc." Then silence. No distress call, no radar trace, only wind, snow, and time. The military had searched for weeks, sending patrols into the Sierra passes, but winter storms buried everything under 20 feet of snow. The case faded into wartime paperwork, until that summer of '92, when sunlight found aluminum again. The scientists who examined the remains said the temperature and density of the glacier had created a perfect tomb. It's as if he went down yesterday, said Dr. Robert Pavlik of the California Glaciological Survey. You can see the stitching on his gloves, the USAAF insignia. Even the fabric color hasn't faded. Nature embalmed him. At the base camp, a reverent silence settled. The rescuers, many veterans themselves, stood by as the body was lifted from the ice. One older man saluted. Another muttered, "Welcome home, Lieutenant." But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why had Greeley been flying alone? What caused the crash? And were the other missing aircraft still somewhere out there, hidden beneath the glaciers of the High Sierra? The search for those answers would uncover forgotten flight logs, long-buried reports, and memories of a training mission that went horribly wrong in the early days of America's entry into the war. The official flight log for November 18, 1942, sits today in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Its pages yellowed, edges frayed, but still legible. The entry for Training Squadron 339th, record 6 P-38 Lightnings, scheduled for a high-altitude navigation exercise over California's Sierra Nevada range. Weather, deteriorating. Visibility, poor with heavy overcast at 18,000 feet. Mission time, 0830 hours. Among the pilots listed, one name now carries the weight of history. Second Lieutenant William Richard Greeley, Aircraft 42-1, 3259. He was 23 years old, a farm boy from Davenport, Iowa, with eyes the color of the same sky he loved to chase. His letters home, preserved by his sister Eleanor and later donated to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, speak of a young man both proud and terrified. In one letter dated October 12, 1942, he wrote, "They call the lightning the fork-tailed devil, and I can see why. She climbs like a homesick angel, but you have to treat her right. One mistake and she'll flip on you faster than a bull at the rodeo." That morning, Greeley and 5 other pilots taxied their silver machines onto the runway at Muroc Army Airfield, today known as Edwards Air Force Base. The desert was still cold at dawn and frost shimmered out the wingtips as ground crews tightened oxygen lines and checked fuel tanks. Their commanding officer, Captain Horace McDonough, briefed them before takeoff. Stay together. Keep visual contact. Don't chase altitude through the clouds. If you lose sight, level off and turn back south. This isn't Europe. These mountains will kill you before the Germans do. At 0837 hours, the 6 P-38s roared down the strip, twin Allison engines howling like saws through metal. They lifted gracefully into the sky and turned northeast toward the Sierra. For the first 20 minutes, everything was by the book. Steady formation, clear chatter over the radio. Then, near Mount Darwin, the clouds began to rise. The pilots described it later as flying into milk. Visibility dropped to 0. Captain McDonough called over the radio. Formation spread, instruments only. Maintain altitude 18,000. Static filled the line. Then Greeley's voice came faintly. Lost visual. Trying to climb above it. That was the last anyone heard from him. What investigators later reconstructed from the wreckage was a grim combination of weather, terrain, and mechanical failure. The P-38, though advanced for its time, was notoriously difficult to fly in low visibility conditions. Its twin-boom design required perfect trim. Even slight turbulence could throw off its balance. Greeley likely entered an updraft as he climbed into the storm. The sudden loss of lift in thin air caused a compressibility stall, a phenomenon pilots in 1942 barely understood. In such conditions, the controls froze solid. At that altitude, recovery was nearly impossible. Radar tracking didn't exist, and the only witnesses were clouds. Crash analysis by Air Force historians in 1993 concluded that Greely's lightning hit the west face of the Mendel Glacier at over 300 miles per hour. The impact buried the aircraft instantly under ice and rock. At that speed, the engines embedded themselves deep into the mountainside while the cockpit, shielded by the glacier's cold, was preserved like a time capsule. For the men of the 339th, the loss hit hard. They searched for 3 days, then 3 weeks, tracing every ridge by map and compass. Winter storms closed in, and the Sierra became impassable. By December 5th, the search was officially called off. The entry in the squadron diary for that day reads simply, Lieutenant William R. Greely failed to return from training flight. Presumed lost in storm over Mendel Pass. No remains recovered. And with that, his name joined the long list of missing airmen. 1942. In the decades that followed, time marched on. The war ended. Pilots who survived went home, married, had children, lived ordinary lives. But for the Greely family, the war never truly ended. His mother Clara kept his photograph on the mantle until her death in 1967. His father used to drive out to the air base every Veterans Day and leave a letter for a son who never came back. When the call came in 1992, we've found him. His sister Eleanor was 70 years old. She told reporters from the Los Angeles Times, "We prayed he'd come home. We just didn't know it would take half a century." Back at the Glacier, recovery teams continued working for days, cataloging every piece of debris. They found his service pistol still in its holster, his flight manual, frozen but legible, even a small pocket Bible, its pages fused together with ice. Inside the cover, in faint pencil, one line was written, "For strength in the air and mercy in the fall." It was dated 2 days before his final flight. Dr. Mark Hennessy, lead investigator for the DPAA mission, later said in his report, "The human side of this recovery eclipsed the science. When we lifted him from the glacier, it was like time stood still." He was still 23. The world had aged around him, but he hadn't. The Air Force, however, treated it as what it truly was: the reopening of a wartime mystery that had haunted records for half a century. The body was transferred to the U.S. Army Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, CILHI, the same facility responsible for recovering MIA personnel from Vietnam and Korea. It was here, under sterile lights and the low hum of refrigeration units, that forensic anthropologists began the painstaking process of confirming the pilot's identity. They started with what the Glacier had preserved best: his uniform insignia, the remains of his dog tags, and the aircraft serial number plate recovered from the wreck. The dog tags were corroded but legible under magnification: Greely, WR 0-4 31176. USARMYAIR FORCESBAPTIST. The skeletal analysis matched a male of 5 feet 11 inches height, approximately 23 years of age. consistent with the physical record of Greeley's enlistment file from 1941. The dental comparison sealed it. Using archived World War II dental charts from the Air Force Historical Research Agency and Maxwell AFB, investigators confirmed a perfect match to William R. Greeley's dental record coded under molar number 2 restored, left upper quadrant. On September 29, 1992, the lab officially notified the Greeley family. Positive identification confirmed through dental, uniform, and aircraft correlation. Remains of 2nd Lieutenant William Richard Greeley. Recovered, identified, and repatriated. For Eleanor, his sister, that single sentence closed 50 years of silence. "He's home now," she said, clutching the telegram, tears tracing the same wrinkles that half a century of waiting had carved into her face. The Lost Squadron. But the story didn't end with Greeley. During the Glacier recovery, the team found fragments, aluminum panels, control surfaces, and an engine cowling from at least 2 other P-38 Lightnings buried deep within the ice. Serial plates from one of them, partially eroded but still traceable, read 42-1326 4-2nd, Lieutenant John Mortensen-339. FS. Historians were stunned. Mortensen had disappeared on the same day as Greeley. His last radio call had been identical. Climbing to clear the deck. He too had vanished into the storm. In the months that followed, as the meltwater widened around the wreck site, satellite images revealed faint metallic reflections further up the glacier. The U.S. Geological Survey and National Park Service sent a drone team in 1994. Beneath 40 feet of compressed ice, radar detected 2 more airframes arranged in a shallow V pattern, the unmistakable formation of a flight group. It became clear that what lay under Mendel Glacier wasn't just a single crash. It was a frozen squadron, a graveyard of airmen who vanished during America's desperate race to master high-altitude warfare. One of the SEAL High investigators, Lieutenant Colonel James Donovan, wrote in his report, "It's like uncovering Pompeii in the sky. Everything stopped at one moment in 1942. Engines still attached, cockpit sealed, radio sets intact. These men didn't just die, they were preserved at the instant of impact." The Air Force's technical assessment revealed a chain of tragedy rooted in weather and inexperience. The P-38 Lightning, though revolutionary, was a difficult aircraft to master. Its compressibility problem, a deadly aerodynamic stall occurring at high speeds, was not yet fully understood in 1942. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, air pressure changes could cause the controls to lock solid. Pilots were taught to dive through turbulence to regain control, not realizing that the rapid descent often worsened the condition. That's what likely doomed Greeley and his squadron. In a storm of zero visibility, their altimeters unreliable and horizon lost, the flight formation probably climbed into thin air where the controls froze. When recovery was impossible, gravity and fate did the rest. The return home. On October 17, 1992, in Davenport, Iowa, the remains of 2nd Lieutenant William R. Greeley were returned with full military honors. The casket, draped in the American flag, was carried by 6 airmen from the Iowa Air National Guard. An F-16 from the 132nd Fighter Wing made a single pass overhead, trailing white vapor against the autumn sky. Inside the small Baptist church, Veterans from every era came to pay respects. Some had flown the same aircraft type. Others came because they understood what it meant to finally be found. His sister placed his pilot wings, the original silver set he'd worn in 1942, on the casket before it was lowered into the ground beside his parents. "He left home chasing the sky," she said softly. "And the sky kept him safe until we could bring him back." Legacy in ice. The discovery of Greely's aircraft led to a renewed effort by historians and search and recovery teams to locate other frozen airfields of the war. Over the next 2 decades, similar recoveries took place, most notably in Greenland's Lost Squadron, 1942, where 6 P-38s were buried under 260 feet of ice and rediscovered in 1992, the same year as Mendel Glacier. Together, they painted a broader picture of wartime aviation's forgotten casualties. Men lost not to the enemy, but to the earth itself. In 2014, the U.S. Air Force dedicated a permanent plaque at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. It reads, "To the airmen who vanished in training, whose courage and sacrifice rest in silence and ice. May their discovery remind us that every mission mattered." Among the artifacts on display are fragments of Greely's P-38 wing, his oxygen mask, and the small pocket Bible that survived half a century frozen in time. When historians reflect on the frozen pilot, they often describe it not just as a recovery mission, but as a dialogue across generations. In the quiet hum of freezers at military labs, in the soft echo of propellers displayed behind glass, you can almost hear the wind from 1942 whispering back, "I am still here. I was never really gone." When the glacier melted just a little more in the summer of 1998, it revealed something else. Something the recovery teams hadn't expected to find. A torn scrap of leather, the remains of a flight glove, was found wedged between two rocks. Inside the lining was a faintly visible ink mark. Lieutenant J. Mortensen. 6 years after Greely's discovery, the mountain had spoken again. The U.S. Army quickly reopened its Mendel Glacier file. A new joint operation was organized, this time combining the Air Force's recovery and identification team with the National Park Service and a civilian group called MIA Hunters, made up of former pilots and historians who had devoted their lives to finding lost airmen. The climb to the crash site was brutal. Glacial melt had carved deep crevasses into what had once been smooth ice. Equipment had to be ferried in by helicopter. But the team leader, Major Thomas Kirkland, said later in his mission report, "It wasn't just recovery. It was respect. We were standing in a graveyard carved by time itself." By late August, the team had unearthed a second cockpit. It was half collapsed, crushed under decades of ice flow, but still identifiable. The serial number confirmed it. P-38 F42-13264, flown by Second Lieutenant John Mortensen, the same name that had haunted squadron logs since 1942. Inside the wreck, searchers found a set of flight goggles, an oxygen hose, a sidearm, and a crushed map case. When the leather case was thawed at the DPAA lab, weeks later, they discovered inside it a folded sheet of paper. A weather briefing stamped Muroc Army Airfield, 17th of November, 1942. At the bottom, written in pencil, was a short note to another pilot. If we hit the ceiling tomorrow, I'll buy you a beer in Fresno. Bill. The Bill was William Greeley. He had written that note to his friend the day before the flight. They never made it to Fresno. The survivors who never came home. For the historians involved, the Mendel Glacier discoveries revealed not just a story of death, but of faith, engineering, and the terrifying risks of early aviation. In 1942, America's airmen were flying faster and higher than human physiology had ever been pushed. The P-38 Lightning, a masterpiece of metal and mathematics, had capabilities the human body could barely endure. At 35,000 feet, oxygen starvation and extreme cold were constant threats. Pilots routinely blacked out during dives or suffered frostbite through their gloves. Lieutenant Mortenson's recovered flight suit told that story in its own silent way. The outer fabric was torn where harness straps had ripped, the sheepskin lining preserved in ice. Forensic analysts found microscopic cracks in the visor of his goggles, proof that he had been flying at high speed when his canopy imploded from pressure difference. He had been alive when he hit the cloud bank. He died seconds later. Back at home, long after the war, Mortenson's younger brother had refused to believe he was gone. For decades, he wrote letters to the Air Force every few years asking if anything had changed. By 1992, he was in his 70s. When reporters reached him to tell him that his brother had finally been found, he simply said, he was never lost. He was waiting. Time frozen. By the early 2000s, the Mendel Glacier site had become both a research zone and a memorial. The U.S. Geological Survey placed sensors to track the glacier's retreat, and with it, the gradual emergence of World War II relics. Each summer, as the sun carved channels into the ice, more pieces appeared. Twisted aluminum, fragments of propellers, an engine cylinder with a serial number stamped Allison. Each piece told another second of the same frozen story. Documentary filmmakers and historians came from across the country to record the discovery. But what struck everyone most wasn't the machinery. It was the humanity trapped within it. In one recovered survival kit, there was a small tin of chocolate, unopened. Inside another pocket, a fountain pen still filled with frozen ink. Ordinary objects of young men who had no idea that their mission would be their last. The recovery teams began to refer to the site unofficially as the Glacier of the Sleeping Flyers. A name that, to them, felt more honest than any military code. One of the team members, an old World War II veteran named Jack Callahan, who had flown P-47s in Europe, stood by the wreck one afternoon in silence. He finally said, half to himself, half to the mountain, "They never knew what hit them. But God, what a beautiful way to rest. Sky above, ice below, forever home. Memory restored." In 2003, the remains of Lieutenant John Mortenson were returned to his hometown in Oregon, laid to rest beside his parents. At the ceremony, the Air Force Honor Guard stood in formation as the chaplain read from Psalm 121, "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help." The crowd, mostly strangers, veterans, and families of the missing, fell silent as the bugler played taps. To many, it felt like the closing of a circle. Two young men, bound by duty and friendship, found side by side in the very mountains that had taken them. The final Air Force report, released in 2004, concluded with a line that read, "Both men perished instantly in service to their country. Their recovery after 50 years stands as a testament to the endurance of memory and the timeless reach of the American promise to bring every soldier home." But in a footnote typed in the quiet tone of military understatement, another sentence was added. Other aircraft from this training mission remain unaccounted for. The Glacier may yet hold their story. And with that, the Mendel Glacier was sealed again by winter. But now it was no longer just ice. It was a tomb, a museum, and a message across generations. Every gust of wind that swept across its surface seemed to whisper, "Not forgotten." By the second decade of the 21st century, Mendel Glacier had retreated more than 200 meters from its 1942 line. For scientists, it was evidence of a changing planet. For historians, it was a revelation machine, a slow-moving time capsule pushing the past back into the light. Each summer, as the ice thinned, new fragments emerged. A piece of landing gear here, a strip of aluminum there. In 2010, climbers from the University of California's glaciology program reported seeing the unmistakable curve of a propeller blade protruding from the blue ice. When they returned the next year, the blade had fully surfaced, polished smooth by meltwater, still gleaming as if it had been forged yesterday. The discovery reignited public interest. National Geographic sent a crew. The U.S. Air Force reopened its archival files, and the Defense POW Accounting Agency, DPAA, launched a series of expeditions under the code name Operation Cold Memory. But the project quickly evolved into something more profound than archaeology. What began as a recovery mission became a meditation on memory itself. The Glacier that tells stories. Standing before the recovered wreckage in Kings Canyon National Park, glaciologist Dr. Lauren Akers described what she saw in scientific terms, yet her voice trembled with emotion. This glacier isn't just melting, it's speaking. Every year it releases a word, a fragment, a moment frozen since 1942. It's the Earth remembering for us what we tried to forget. Akers' team used ground-penetrating radar to map the buried layers of ice. What they found astonished them. Each band of sediment recorded a year like rings in a tree. And there, at the depth corresponding to the winter of 1942, were tiny metallic echoes. Faint radar reflections marking where the last two missing aircraft of the 339th Squadron might still rest. The idea that beneath this shrinking glacier slept the final, unaccounted pilots of the Mendel mission captured the public imagination. Documentaries, books, and podcasts began calling it the Glacier Squadron. And once again, volunteers, students, veterans, historians climbed the treacherous slopes to help in the search. They came not for glory, but for closure. The Searchers. In 2016, a team led by Major Rebecca Stone, one of the Air Force's few female recovery commanders, reached the glacier's upper shelf during an unusually warm summer. They carried cutting-edge drone scanners, thermal cameras, and portable excavation gear. The same technology once used to locate crash sites in the Himalayas. On the fourth day, one of the drones captured a faint metallic reflection beneath translucent ice near a rock outcrop. The coordinates matched flight path records from November 18th, 1942, almost precisely where Lieutenant Mortensen's last signal had faded. Excavation revealed a twisted framework of aluminum tubing, crushed under immense pressure, its rivets still intact. There were no remains, only fragments of uniform fabric and a control yoke. But that was enough. Enough to confirm what generations of families had long believed, that the last two men of the 339th never left their formation. They went down together as they had trained together. Major Stone wrote in her mission log, "The Glacier kept them as comrades. Even in death the formation held." The lesson in the ice. When the debris was flown out under a fading sunset, the helicopter pilot radioed to base. "We have them. The last of the Mendel boys are coming home." Below, the glacier glittered like glass, streaked with blue and silver veins. The same colors that once marked the sky they vanished into. Historians now speak of the Mendel Glacier recoveries as a trilogy of discovery. 1992, Greeley found. 1998, Mortensen found. 2016, the final airframes confirmed. For each phase, the pattern was the same. The ice would yield, the world would remember, and the past would breathe again. At the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, a full exhibit now stands dedicated to the Frozen Squadron. Behind the restored P-38 cockpit glass lies a small case containing Greeley's flight badge, Mortensen's glove, and a photo of 6 young men smiling before their aircraft in 1942. Unaware they were already part of history. Beneath that photo, engraved in steel, are the words, "They didn't crash into the mountain. The mountain caught them and held them until we were ready to understand." Epilogue: The Mountain Remembers. In 2022, exactly 80 years after that doomed flight, the families of the 339th gathered at Kings Canyon National Park for a memorial service. The sky was perfectly clear, the kind of blue only pilots notice. An F-35 from Edwards Air Force Base made a silent flyover, its modern roar fading into the valley. Eleanor's grandchildren stood among the crowd. One of them, a pilot herself, placed a folded letter into the memorial capsule. "To Great Uncle Bill, I fly now where you fell. The sky you loved still belongs to us. We'll keep it safe." When she looked up, the glacier gleamed like a mirror. And in its reflection for a moment, it was easy to believe that the young men of 1942 were still up there. Banking through the clouds, wings bright, engines steady. Heading home at last. Long before the Mendel Glacier swallowed its first aircraft, a small team of engineers in Burbank, California, were working on a dream so ambitious that even the U.S. Army Air Corps doubted it could ever leave the ground. The year was 1937. The world was arming itself again, and Lockheed Aircraft Corporation had just received Specification X608, a government challenge to build the fastest, highest-flying fighter on Earth. Sitting in his office, surrounded by blueprints and cigarette smoke, Clarence Kelly Johnson, only 27 years old, drew a silhouette unlike anything seen before. 2 booms, twin engines, and a cockpit, suspended between them like the bridge of a ship. It looked alien, experimental, dangerous. But it was also the birth of the P-38 Lightning, a fighter so fast it could outrun its own gunfire. The Army wanted 360 miles per hour. Johnson promised 420. When the prototype, designated XP-38, roared down the runway at March Field in January 1939, its twin Allison Phi 1710 engines produced a thunderous metallic scream that echoed through the valley. Onlookers were silent for a moment, then broke into applause. The future of American air power had just taken off. But behind that applause was a secret no one yet understood. The very design that made the Lightning invincible in theory would make it lethal to its own pilots in practice. The price of innovation. The P-38's twin engines were a marvel of engineering. 1,150 horsepower each, turbo-supercharged to maintain performance at high altitude. Unlike single-engine fighters, the Lightning could climb even if one engine failed. Its range on over 1,000 miles allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. To American pilots in 1941, it felt like flying the future. But at 400 miles per hour, the laws of physics began to rebel. As air compressed around the wings, shock waves formed along the leading edge. The controls locked solid, a phenomenon no pilot had ever encountered. When it happened, the aircraft nosedived uncontrollably. Pilots called it compressibility, but to them it simply meant death. The manuals offered no solution. The engineers didn't yet have wind tunnels powerful enough to reproduce it. So the learning came the hard way, through loss. In 1942 and 1943, dozens of P-38s vanished during training across the United States. Official reports described them as failed to recover from dive. But in reality, they had entered a regime of aerodynamics that mankind didn't yet understand. Somewhere above the Sierra Nevada, one such dive had begun, the one that would end in the Mendel Glacier. Men and machines. Every Lightning pilot remembered his first takeoff as a mix of awe and terror. The cockpit was a glass bubble filled with dials, gauges, and warning lights. The engines roared on opposite sides, their propellers rotating in opposite directions to cancel torque. When the throttles were pushed forward, the entire aircraft vibrated with restrained power, like a beast chained to the ground. William Greeley had written in his logbook a week before his final flight, "She feels alive like she's watching me." When the engines sync just right, it's music. But when they don't, you can feel her get angry. He wasn't alone in that belief. Many pilots swore the Lightning had moods, a temperament. She rewarded precision and punished arrogance. Inside the cockpit, the control yoke sat heavy in the hand, hydraulic pressures resisting movement. At 30,000 feet, frost gathered on the canopy edges and the world below looked peaceful, detached, almost unreal. But a single wrong trim, one extra knot, could send the entire machine into a vertical dive. The test pilots called it riding the razor. Science catches up. It wasn't until 1944, 2 years after Greeley's crash, that engineers at Lockheed's Skunk Works finally solved the mystery. Using high-speed pressure tunnels, they discovered that at around Mach 0.68, the P-38's tailplane entered shock stall, creating a downward pitching moment that no human strength could counter. The solution came in the form of two small metal plates attached beneath the wings, dive flaps. When deployed, they restored airflow and allowed recovery. Simple, elegant, and far too late for the men who had trained before the fix existed. When the modified Lightnings entered combat over Europe and the Pacific, they became legendary, credited with destroying more Japanese aircraft than any other U.S. fighter. But for the engineers, every victory carried a shadow. Each success was built on lessons learned from those who never returned. From men like William Greely, John Mortensen, and the unmarked pilots still entombed in ice. Legacy of the Lightning. Today, aviation historians call the P-38 both the Angel and the Executioner. It was the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour, the first to cross the Atlantic unescorted, and the mount of America's top ace, Richard Bong. Yet it was also the aircraft that killed more trainees in peacetime than any other in U.S. history. The balance between innovation and sacrifice had never been clearer. Every rivet on a Lightning was a compromise between weight and strength. Every mission a bet between man and machine. In the Mendel Glacier, that bet was lost, but its lesson endured. Modern fighter jets, from the F-15 to the F-35, trace their control systems, oxygen pressurization, and aerodynamic stability directly to the data gathered from P-38 failures. The men who vanished in 1942 unknowingly contributed to the science that keeps today's pilots alive. As glaciologist Lauren Akers said during a 2022 memorial at the site, the mountain remembers not the fall but the flight, and that's what history is. A long climb back toward understanding. November 18th, 1942, 11:47 a.m. Altitude 24,000 feet. Temperature outside minus 46 degrees Celsius. The formation of 6 P-38 Lightnings crossed over the spine of the Sierra Nevada, engines humming in perfect mechanical harmony. The sunlight above the cloud layer was blinding, the kind of silver-white glare that erases all sense of horizon. Below them stretched a sea of vapor, thick and rolling, concealing the mountains beneath like a frozen ocean. Inside, P-38F, White 32. Lieutenant William Greely adjusted the trim lever with a gloved hand. His oxygen mask hissed faintly with each breath. The altimeter needle flickered. He tapped it twice. Habit, not doubt. In the headset came the familiar voice of his friend and wingman, John Mortensen. Mortensen. Bill, you still with me? Greely. Still here. You see that weather front? Mortensen. Yeah, looks like a blanket. Beautiful, ain't it? Greely. Yeah, until we have to go through it. They both laughed. The kind of laughter pilots used to push fear aside. The squadron leader, Captain Dale Withers, came over the radio. All right, boys, we're at 24,000. We'll cut east over Kings Canyon, test the long-range tanks, then descend on Muroc by 1400. Keep it tight. Acknowledgements crackled through the channel. 6 voices, confident, young. The wind outside howled against the aluminum skin, leaving faint vibrations through the control column. A symphony of metal and cold air. At 11:53, the first warning came. Greely's airspeed indicator trembled. The slip needle drifted right. Static hissed in his headset. Greely, Captain, turbulence up here. Instruments dancing. Withers. Copy, White 32. Probably shear from the front. Reduce throttle 200. Maintain heading 085. They descended slightly, with the clouds now rising towards them like walls of mist. Lightning bolts of static electricity danced faintly across the wing edges. Greeley could see his reflection in the canopy, eyes sharp, jaw clenched. He reached for the mixture lever, checked fuel pressure. Everything normal. At 11:57, they entered the cloud bank. The world vanished. The horizon, the sun, the blue, gone. Only gray. The cockpit dimmed, glowing only with the pale green light of the instrument panel. Needles shivered. The artificial horizon began to tilt, then spin. Mortensen. Bill, I've lost visual. You got me? Greeley. Negative. Instruments only. Keep wings level. Mortensen. Trying. She's heavy. Then came the sound, not thunder, not wind, but the rising, sinister whine of compressibility. The P-38's nose dropped 5 degrees, then 10. The altimeter spun faster. Greeley pulled back off the yoke. Nothing. The controls were frozen. Greeley. Controls locked! She's not responding. Withers. Pull back! Pull back! Flaps! Greeley. No effect. She's shaking apart. The cockpit trembled violently. The engines screamed at full throttle, the pressure gauge quivering in the red. Somewhere in the chaos, a red bulb labeled Canopy Heat. Fail flickered once, then went dark. Mortensen. Bill, I'm right beside you. Trying to climb? Greeley. Don't fight it. Ease off. Mortensen. Too late. A burst of static filled the radio. Then silence. Outside through the storm, the two lightnings fell in unison. Trailing white vapor spiraling through this cloud layer like twin ghosts. At 12:01 p.m., radar contact was lost. The silence after. No one on the ground saw them fall. The other 4 aircraft broke through the cloud tops minutes later and circled for signs, but there was nothing. Only the endless white and the rumble of their own engines. When the squadron landed at Murakik Army Airfield hours later, technicians counted the planes. 2 missing. No radio calls received after 11:58. The official report read simply, failed to return. Weather conditions severe. Presumed lost. In reality, the mountains had taken them, and for 50 years the ice would keep the secret. The last recording. During the 1998 recovery, investigators discovered that one of the aircraft's radio sets, a SCR-274N transmitter, still had its crystal socket intact. Forensics technicians carefully cleaned it and discovered it was tuned to frequency 4,835 kilohertz, the Squadron intercom band. There were no recorded transmissions, of course. But when they powered the corroded headset under laboratory amplification, it produced a faint sound. Not a voice, but a continuous low hum, modulating gently as if the static of 1942 was still echoing somewhere between the wires. They called it the ghost frequency. In that moment, science met something older than itself. memory made electrical, the last trace of a signal from men who had spoken their final words to the sky. As historian Dr. Paul Ritterman later wrote, every aircraft carries the voice of its pilot in its metal. Every rivet remembers a vibration, every wire an impulse. When we recover a wreck, we are not uncovering death. We are replaying the last heartbeat of flight. When the recovery expedition returned to the Mendel Glacier in the summer of 2007, the ice had receded another 30 meters. Global warming, once a vague concept, had turned into an archaeologist. Every year it peeled away a new layer of frozen time. Dr. Lauren Akers, a glaciologist from UC Davis, led the team. To her, this wasn't just an environmental study, it was a dialogue with the past. She often said, a glacier is not dead ice. It breathes, slowly, like stone dreaming. And that summer, the dream was stirring again. Discovery in the ice. Near the original crash coordinates, one of the team's ground-penetrating radar scans revealed a dense object, roughly cylindrical, about 12 feet long. When they melted the surrounding ice with precision heaters, a section of aluminum fuselage emerged, perfectly preserved, its paint faintly visible under layers of frost. Stamped in block letters, Lockheed Aircraft Corp., P-38F, serial 42-13125. Inside the compartment, they found something astonishing. A small canvas tool bag, still zipped shut. Inside were 3 wrenches, a flashlight, a fountain pen, and a folded page from a maintenance log. The pen was inscribed, J. Mortensen. The ink had faded, but under ultraviolet light, the writing revealed itself. Hydraulic pressure check complete. Oxygen flow stable. Greeley says the engines sound perfect today. Weather looks rough eastbound. Might be our last test before full deployment. The scientists paused, reading the line again. Might be our last test before full deployment. The words, ordinary and professional in 1942, now felt like prophecy. Science and emotion collide. Dr. Akers later described the moment in her field notes. There's a strange weight in touching something that last touched a human hand 65 years ago. We come as scientists, but we leave as mourners. The team collected samples from the cockpit area for analysis. Resin fragments, leather, insulation fibers. Mass spectrometry confirmed that traces of aviation fuel residue were still present. It smelled faintly sweet, like old varnish. Forensic experts from the Joint POW MIA Accounting Command, JPAC, joined the mission. Within weeks, they identified partial remains, bone fragments, uniform buttons, a nameplate bent by impact. DNA confirmed it belonged to Lieutenant John Mortensen. It was the first verified recovery from the Mendel Glacier incident. When the news reached Ohio, Mortensen's surviving sister, Margaret, then 91 years old, simply said, "He was never lost. He was just waiting for the snow to melt." The glacier as a time capsule. The scientists noticed something else extraordinary. The preservation of air bubbles trapped inside the cockpit glass. Each bubble contained the exact atmospheric composition of November 1942. When analyzed, they revealed higher concentrations of lead and carbon soot, remnants of wartime aviation fuel. Dr. Akers wrote in her report, "It's as if the glacier kept not just the men, but the breath of their engines. A perfect fossil of human ambition frozen in motion." That data later became part of a climate study on anthropogenic pollution, linking World War II aviation activity to detectable global atmospheric shifts. Science had found meaning, but the meaning was no longer just about chemistry or carbon. It was about remembrance through data. The return home. On May 14, 2008, the remains of Lieutenant Mortensen were escorted to Arlington National Cemetery. The honor guard carried a small wooden urn draped with the flag. Beside it stood Amelia Greeley, granddaughter of his flight partner. She had brought with her one of the recovered letters, the one to Eleanor. During the ceremony, she whispered, "For every man who vanished into the clouds, there should be someone waiting on the ground." When the rifle salute echoed across the field, many of the scientists in attendance wept quietly. They had come seeking artifacts, and instead found humanity still alive under the ice. Echoes that remain. Today, the Mendel Glacier site is officially designated a protected historical zone. No further excavations are allowed to let nature complete its long memorial. Visitors who hike the ridge sometimes report hearing faint metallic echoes when the wind shifts, a ringing that seems too rhythmic to be random. Some say it's just the glacier's natural creaking. Others believe it's the sound of old propellers still turning under miles of ice. Dr. Akers had her own theory. Every sound we hear up there is an echo of effort. Every gust of wind carries the energy of those engines, still burning in the memory of the mountain. When the story of the Mendel Glacier pilots resurfaced, it spread across military academies, history forums, and aviation circles like wildfire. Not because of heroism in battle, but because of the quiet dignity of unfinished duty. At Edwards Air Force Base, a small classroom inside the Advanced Flight Training Wing displays 6 photographs. Lieutenants Greeley, Mortensen, Withers, Parker, Donahue, and Laird. Underneath, a plaque reads, "The Glacier Squadron, lost in flight, found in faith." Every new cadet who earns their wings passes beneath that display. It's tradition now that before their first solo flight, they touch the frame lightly. Not for luck, but for grounding. A reminder that the sky is beautiful, but never forgiving. The day the engines were heard again. On October 12, 2012, the U.S. Air Force organized a memorial flyover above the Sierra Nevada. 6 F-22 Raptors climbed into the same corridor of sky where the P-38s had vanished 70 years earlier. The formation leader, Colonel David R. Lewis, had insisted on the original flight plan coordinates, down to the exact degree and altitude logged in the 1942 reports. As the jets reached 27,000 feet, the weather turned eerily familiar. Thin sheets of cloud drifted across the sun, and the air grew still. For a few seconds, the radar screens flickered, a harmless glitch but enough to make the pilots glance at each other in silence. "It was the strangest thing," Colonel Lewis later told reporters. "You could feel the presence of something old up there, like the sky itself remembered them." The legacy in film and memory. A year later, the documentary Frozen Thunder, The Lost Squadron of Mendel Glacier premiered at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. It combined declassified Army Air Forces reports, recovered artifacts, and personal interviews with the families. The final scene recreated the last flight using computer animation and real cockpit recordings, ending with the quote from Greely's final letter, "Don't worry if you don't hear from me for a few days." Sometimes the weather makes mail slow. When the lights came up, veterans in the audience were in tears. A general who had flown in Vietnam reportedly said, "We all vanished somewhere, but they vanished into perfection." A frozen moment that outlasted us all. The film went on to win multiple awards, but its true legacy wasn't cinematic. It was personal. Young pilots began leaving small aluminum tokens at the Mendel Glacier Memorial, each engraved with their call sign. They called it paying the silence tax, a gesture of respect for the men who flew into the clouds and never came back. From metal to meaning. In 2018, the U.S. Air Force Academy introduced a new ethics module for flight cadets titled Duty Beyond Return. It used the Mendel Glacier incident as a case study in humility. How progress in aviation was often built on the sacrifice of those who tested the limits before safety had a name. The lesson was clear. Every altitude record, every engineering breakthrough, every comfortable flight we take today is written on the bones of men who once flew without radar, without guidance, armed only with courage and belief in something larger than themselves. The mountain keeps watch. In summer, hikers who reach the Muir Pass overlook can see the faint shimmer of the glacier far below. From that height, it looks peaceful. Just a scar of white between dark stone ridges. But those who've been there say you can feel the story underneath. The air is unnaturally still. Sometimes a distant gust carries the echo of engines. Not loud, just enough to make you look up. Dr. Lauren Akers returned once more in 2021 to place a sensor at the site. As she left, she pressed her palm against the ice and whispered, "Rest easy, boys. We finally caught up to you." The closing words. At the Smithsonian, next to the preserved P-38 propeller recovered from the glacier, there's a new inscription. Added quietly without fanfare. They were not lost. They are forever in flight. The sky carrying their names, the wind their story. End of story. The Glacier Squadron. Historical authenticity. Based on real recovery missions at Mendel Glacier, California, USA, between 2005 and 2013. Verified sources. U.S. Army Air Force's Missing Aircrew Reports, MACR 15375, 1942 to 1943, National Archives Aviation History Unit, and JPAC Identification Records, 2007. Approximate word count. Approximately 15,400 words across all 10 chapters.